G'day mates, it's Donny from Donny's Garage and Adventures. Tonight I'm just going to go through just a couple of things about controllers. There's a lot of people on Xlights that have been asking a few questions about, what controller do I use, what do I need to think about. So I'm just going to run through a couple of the things that I've learned over the years to think about, so I can give everyone my 2 cents on what you need to be considering before you buy your own, your first controllers. Okay, so this is the controllers that I use currently, which are the Pixelite Mark II, Pixelite 16 Mark II version 1.1s. So these are kind of very similar to the Falcon F48 boards. They're in Australia, at least. You can actually order them from the company Advatec Lighting direct from Victoria, so you can actually get them shipped within Australia. Like I said, they're very similar to a Falcon F48. But the things to look at is you will hear a lot of people talk about outputs. So output is basically how many different individual outputs, which are these things along here, is effectively an output off the controller that you're going to use to run something. So this controller has 16 outputs that you can actually then configure per output how many lights, how many channels, universes, etc. you're going to have on each output. So that's probably one of the first things to consider is what are you actually going to run off your controller? Are you going to try to run a whole heap of different things, or are you just trying to run one prop, for example, or a few little bits and pieces in your yard? Or are you trying to run a huge amount of lights, in which case you might need a controller like this where you've got 16 outputs? Okay, another thing that you should really consider is how you're actually going to configure the controllers. So some people don't like this. I don't really mind it because for a lot of the controllers, normally once we have them set up for the December show, we don't really touch them. But with the Advatec controllers, you actually need to have their own software, which doesn't cost any money. It's free. You can just download it. But it means that when you need to log in and change something, you need a computer that has the software on it that's then connected into your local area network to be able to access the configuration. So I've just shown here now that's the Pixelite I was just showing you before. We can double click on it, and then via here is actually where we can set the different pixel IC. We can test the output of the lights. We can also, under the advanced section as well, we can specify how many channels, whether we're zigzagging, whether we've got null pixels, the intensity of the lights as well. So there's a lot of different things you can handle from this one configuration page. Now, a couple of the advantages that the Falcon controllers have over the Advatec lighting controllers is these currently only support one pixel type per controller. So whatever you set as the pixel IC here is the pixels that you have to use on every single output. Now, some of the Falcons, I think the newer ones are going to change this to act like the Advatecs do, but some of the older Falcons, you can actually set that pixel IC per individual output. So if you've got a mix of things that you've gathered over the years, then you might want to have a Falcon that you can actually specify different pixel IC chips with. But in this case, all my pixels are either WS2812 or 2811, so I'm perfectly fine to use these. Alright, now just back looking at the controller again, just going to talk through another couple of things to consider. One thing is these cases, Advatec do actually make like a plug and play kit where it's in a case, everything's ready to go. Otherwise, if you're building your own kit, also think about the dimensions of everything that you've got. So this enclosure is a CG1500 enclosure, so same as what you'll see many other people use. This is a 320 watt mean-well power supply, and that's the entire Pixelite board. All fits in there quite snug and quite nicely. So just be conscious of how much space you've actually got in your enclosure boxes as to whether you're going to be able to fit your controller and everything you need in there. Now, the next thing to consider is, we spoke about the amount of outputs that you've got. The next thing to consider is how many lights or how many pixels can your actual output support. So on some of the earlier Pixelite controllers, they only supported, I think it was 340 pixels per output. This controller, as far as I remember, is 1020 per output. So that just basically means that off one port, you can effectively push enough data for 1020 pixels. Whereas on the earlier controllers, you can only push enough data for 340. So if you're setting up something like a massive Megatree and you want to run, just per port pixels, you might be able to get away with some of the cheaper controllers because you only need to run one port per output. But if you want to run, which is what we normally do, is we might have a matrix that's got 1200 pixels and we'll use only two outputs to run but like everything that we need for that one matrix, rather than using up an entire controller for that. So there's advantages and disadvantages in doing it that way, but it just allows you to at least, with the controller that allows for multiple lights per output, gives you more options in terms of what you can do. These controllers as well also support DMX. So you've probably seen a lot of people talk about using fog machines or flamethrowers or fog cannons. That's normally what these ports are for, the DMX ports, which can be mapped as well. Another thing to consider would be, do you have auxiliary power? So on this side we've got a 3 amp fuse, which can also be used to drive an auxiliary fan, which you can set temperatures and stuff, and when that kicks in. And we've also got as well, on each output, you've got a 4 amp fuse, which is actually supplied from factory. I've checked with the guys from Pixlite, and they say that you can actually support up to a 5 amp fuse. So it's basically 5 amps for each 12 volt output that you've got safely. Anything above that, then you're probably likely to cause yourself some grief if you are drawing that amount of power. But that's another thing to consider, is what amount of power per output can you draw, especially if you're not power injecting. Alright, I'm just showing everyone now. This is the controllers, well, 2 of the controllers that we actually use for our show. Mine are mounted inside, so I've just basically mounted the box on the wall. Just means at Christmas time when we set everything up, it's all ready to go, all labelled. The reason why I've got C53 and A actually written on it is so that I know that this is the last digits of the IP address of 53, and I just call it controller A, so that if I label things, I can label it 16A or 16B or 16C or whatever controller it relates to. So if you're going to put a controller outside, also think about that, because the Pixlites, from memory, they're only rated to operate in up to 40 degrees Celsius. So inside here, it's unlikely that they'll get to that temperature. But if you're in Australia, then it's likely you might exceed that. So just be conscious of where you're actually going to position your controllers, because it does matter. Just as a side note as well, you don't have to use these massive big controllers, especially if you're just getting into the hobby where you want to learn some different bits and pieces. These boards, again, they're a Hanson Electronics device, the RPi 28D. These are actually a controller that just sits on top, so they're a Pi hat. They actually just plug into a Raspberry Pi. One of the really cool things about these controllers is the port here, 12 volt and 0 volt. You can actually power your Raspberry Pi through the power input from this board. And then you've got actually pixel outputs as well. So if you want to just get used to how pixels work, get something like this. Don't bother spending, these controllers here, the Pixlite 16 version, or Mark II version 1.1, I think they're about $350. These guys are a lot less expensive. Alan Hansen in Australia ships them worldwide. So if you want something to just get used to, understanding channels, understanding universes, definitely think about getting one of these just to get used to how that all works. All right, cheers everyone. I hope everyone's learnt something out of that video. So just remember, the main things to think about are, how much power are you going to need for the props that you're running? Where are you going to put your controllers, and what climate are you in? In Australia, we do have summers that go over 40 degrees. So some of these controllers, depending on when you're running them, may actually fail due to heat. So in America, you've got snow, you've got other things to worry about. So think about where the controllers are running. A lot of the time, you can actually see that data online, like on the manufacturer's website. They'll actually put an operating temperature of where they'll actually operate to, down to below freezing up to wherever they actually will operate. Think about as well whether you actually need a massive controller. A lot of people that are coming into their first year, that you might just want to learn how it all works. The RPi 28D that you can get from Hanson Electronics is really good for that. So just think a little bit about it. Think as well, like I said, not all controllers are equal. So you've got to think about how many pixels per output. Again, you might be able to find some secondhand controllers that don't have a high pixel per output count, but they're going to be suitable for the props that you're going to be running. So just think about that and do all your planning around those things. The reason why we run these Pixlites is gives us a lot of capacity. We do run, if anyone's seen our videos on Min My Road Light Show Facebook page, you'll see we run a lot of matrices, which basically just means that we can either run with a lot of ports, or we can run with a couple of ports to run those entire screens. So that's the reason why we're running these. It just gives us a lot more options than running the Mark 1s or other smaller controllers. So yeah, hopefully that sort of answers some questions for people as to what you should think about before you buy your first controller. Again, just remember that you don't have to start massive. You can start really small. The first year, if everyone goes to www.facebook.com/minmyroadlightshow, you'll be able to see the very early years we did very little, and we had a couple of SanDevices controllers because we were just learning what we were doing. The next year we moved to the Pixlite 3.6s because we added a few more things on, and now we've gone to the Mark 2s to get that additional output. But that's because our show's grown over that time. Don't feel like you've got to spend millions of dollars to get up and running. You don't. You can start with something really basic to get the idea around what you're doing. All right. Cheers, everyone. Make sure you subscribe and definitely hit the bell as well so you get notified of any new videos. Thanks.